About the washing machine, it said it was broken the other one. They look worn out, all of them. All of the carers, all the carers look worn out. Carers look worn out. That's all in there, you could slow it. pictures to prove it, yeah. The picture to prove it. Oh, no.
Pay the people, I'll pay
Send
that
me a
cheaper.
picture. Okay. Have to have a Jacob. Have to have a couple of hours on Saturday.
All right.
What's the day? 2 hours.
Emma,
You said the sore throat's really gone now.
yeah.
Really gone. That
We
was
went
up
to
and
the
down.
art,
Thursday.
Etihad, Singapore,
nasty speech.
I've got literally
Is the audio on? I can't hear it.
Testing. Testing.
Wait a minute.
Need to be a bit
Do a
louder.
test, 1 minute, Neil.
I think it might need to be a bit louder.
That's good.
Who's doing the amp? PA. Does that sound loud enough? I can't really. Yeah.
No matter how small you think it is, it's
Does this need to be a bit louder, or is it okay? Oh, is that fine?
That's good, that's fine.
It's fine now. Fine. Okay. A little bit louder. A little bit louder. Testing. A little bit louder. Testing. Yeah?
How are you? You alright?
Yeah, I think so.
Yes, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Chartham Super Stand in the Park. And it's a great honour for me to be invited to be compere today. I lived in Chartham for many years, and I was very much part of the freedom movement here. And I remember that night, the 4th of January 2021, that dark night where 6 of us gathered on the high street. Marika was one of them, and that back then it was actually illegal to meet as a group of 6 people on the high street, but it was reasonably close to the bus stop, so we could get away with pretending we were waiting for a bus. But we then made a presence there every Thursday evening, and then we added Sunday as well. Melissa Campbell started a Stand in the Park group in the Grove, and they still meet 10 o'clock on Sundays, but 11 o'clock we all go onto the high street with yellow boards. Well, I say we because I'm no longer living here. I moved 3 years ago, but I'm very pleased to see that the high street yellow board gang is going as strong as ever and getting lots of support from passing motorists and pedestrians on the high street. We did get a lot of stick at first, but now more and more people are realizing that we were right all along. So, but that's my background with the Chartham group. I also write for the Light newspaper, which of course many of you will know. And we've got, I don't know if she's here today, but we've got a kamikaze light distributor who goes out into the middle of the high street and makes sure that passing motorists have to wind down their window and take a copy, take a dose of truth. The Light paper has been getting attacked by the BBC, Mariana Spring, who's clearly an asset of the security services, and there's lots of smear jobs going on. Wherever the Light is given out, Chartham is a big hub for light distribution. We've got East Sussex, where I am, Stroud in Gloucestershire, Totnes. These places are all being targeted now by people trying to claim that we're all extremists, that we're conspiracy theorists, we're very nasty people, when actually we're about freedom. Now, sometimes we use the word awake. We describe ourselves as awake and the normies as asleep. But really, it's not as simple as that. None of us have reached a final destination. We're all on a journey. And my goodness, what a journey most of us have been on over the last 4 years. And I have to say I was pretty much asleep before COVID, but straight away I knew COVID-19 was a hoax. And then I started to wake up to all the other things that are going on as well. But I think we need to be flexible, and we need to be patient, and we need to be tolerant of people having different levels of awakeness about what's going on in the world. And I'm sure there'll be many people here today who took the COVID injections, some of whom may regret it. And I think our job is not to be purists. Our job is to help people to wake up. So there's a lot of state propaganda. In fact, the last 4 years has been all state propaganda, and it's continued ever since. So it hasn't ended with COVID. It's carrying on with Ukraine, with Israel, and the climate hoax as well. Oh, and talking of which, I cannot avoid the opportunity of giving a plug for my new book, which is called Green in Tooth and Claw, The Misanthropic Mission of Climate Alarm. And Rob is over there with the shades on, and he'll be selling copies of my book today. $12.99 on Amazon, but £10 to any of you here today, and I can also sign it for you if you like. Bargain. So here we are in this lovely park, the Grove, a lovely green setting. And the thing is that while we're critical about all of the scams that are going on, COVID, climate change, probably many of us here really are green. We really are interested in protecting our environment. And actually what the globalist technocrats want, the way that they use the word green, is completely disingenuously. Because for the globalist technocrats, green means synthetic. They want to take away our natural food, our natural environment. They want us to live in a digital surveillance state. And there's nothing more dystopian than their plan for people to live in smart cities. And you'll see Sutton just up the road, the high-rise apartment blocks are going up. Every time you visit Sutton, there's another block going up. And this is what they have all around London, these hubs, where they have people living increasingly in these high-rise blocks where, of course, eventually they'll have the full smart city surveillance system rolled out, where everyone's movement will be monitored. So there's lots of things going on. And sometimes when we have yellow boards on the high street, here in Carshalton or down in Bexhill, where I am now, sometimes you have passers-by who'll say things like, it doesn't make sense. What's all these different messages you're giving out? You know, you've got something here about the climate, something here about vaccines, something here about war. And what we need to get across to people, and it's a difficult one, is to explain that we're joining up the dots, because these things are all part of the same program. They're all part of the Great Reset. And the Great Reset is not just some throwaway book that came out in July 2020, written by the sort of Bond villain character who runs the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab. No, the Great Reset is a project that has been many years, in fact, many decades in the making. And COVID-19 allowed them to take a giant stride towards this global technocracy that they're trying to create. So, look, we're all going to learn something today. We've got some excellent speakers. And I would just say from the outset, if you think that it's nothing but water vapor, if you think that 2 aluminium planes destroyed the World Trade Center, if you think that astronauts walked on the moon in 1969, but the technology has since been lost, if you think that those injections were safe and effective, if you think that we're in the midst of a climate emergency and will soon be submerged by rising tides, if you think that removing cash is for your benefit, if you think that paying more tax will reduce carbon dioxide, if you think that surveillance cameras are to keep you safe, and if you think that politicians are working in your best interests, then you've got a lot to learn from attending today. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. David Yes, good point. Yeah. We had a super stand in the park in Reigate last year. Was anyone there today? Yep. And I think everyone agrees that that went very well. There was only one complaint, one concern though, and that was that when people were speaking, there was a lot of chat going on. Now, what the organisers today have done is that they've, rather than have just continuous speaking throughout the afternoon, we've built in breaks so people have time to talk. So I think it's just important that we can hear the speakers. So David Charalambos, I've got to pronounce your name wrong. David Charalambos, how's that? David Charalambos. He is a behavior and communication expert. He's a founder of reachingpeople.net, which is a project helping people to communicate with those of differing views and showing how institutions and corporations gain influence over our autonomy. He has 30 years of experience in consulting with multinational clients and one-to-one work with people from all walks of life. His studies of psychology and the mind have focused on neuro-linguistic programming and behavioral science. David has spent the last 4 years assisting many groups in understanding how governments have used behavioral psychology to exert influence on society. He runs regular workshops and presentations on how to communicate and to understand what the powers that be are trying to do to us. David, we are looking forward to your words of wisdom.
Hello, good afternoon. Okay, so how many people have shared a ironclad fact the last 3 years, 4 years, and been called a conspiracy theorist?
Okay, there's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of false data out there, and that's why we've got to use a lot of discernment. There was a Dr. Semmelweis over 100 years ago who had worked out that when he washed his hands in a specific water, then the death rate in his hospital dropped through the floor. It went down significantly. He went to the medical establishment and he informed him of the data, and he was put into a mental institute. Now, 20, 30 years later, that point was proven to be true. So the main point of the project really is we've got to create a dialogue with other people that we can actually get our point across. Now, just telling people facts does not work, yeah? I think we can all acknowledge that. And really what the project is also looking to do is to really get the sides talking. That makes sense? So when we're talking to each other, not shouting at each other, then there's a much better chance of the truth arising. About 4 years ago, I started to have a few conversations with people and then suddenly realized something very strange was going on. Okay? Previously, I would be very good at debating. I would be able to introduce facts into the conversation and then people would listen. But people were very much shut down. This what alerted me to what was going on with behavioral science, and anyone really should have a look on the internet to find a document called Mindspace. That document in it is authored by the government and it's given out to all the government departments, and it's really how to influence the public. But there's a really important question that's missing there, and that's consent. Yeah, it's very alarming to imagine that someone can influence us without our consent or our knowledge. Okay, and the technology really does exist now that people can influence each other. Now, I think one of the basic tenets of human nature is that we want to have free will. Yeah, we want to have a control over our destiny. And if people are starting to really impact that control, then we have a major problem. A few weeks ago, I interviewed psychologist Gary Sidley. He's been a psychologist for 30 years, retired from the NHS. And like me, he was also very alarmed And he got together with a large group of psychologists, and they wrote a letter to the Psychological Association, and they said to them, look, we're very concerned at the use of manipulation of the public. Their response was, no, we're okay with it. Okay. The institutions may be okay with it, but I don't know a single member of public that is happy being manipulated in a psychological way. So much so that in the US, up until 2008, it was actually illegal to use psyops on the public. And it was Obama that actually repealed that. So it's now legal in the US to psychologically manipulate the public. So that really is one of the greatest problems that I have and greatest concerns. But what I wanted to do today was just share a couple of things that will really start to help conversations go better. We can really only dip our toe in, but you can go to the website and there's lots of videos there. And since I really looked into behavioral science in a deep way, I've not been called a conspiracy theorist since, okay? Because there's a certain way that you have to create a conversation. And once you create the right way, then information will go back and forth. It's really important not to think we know everything because there's so much information out there. How will we ever know? So there was just a couple of points I wanted to make. And one of them really, the first point is what's I think it was Feldenkrais that pointed out the elusive obvious. What happens is that when we do something so often and so many times, it just becomes a habit, okay? And then we just do it regardless. So how many people have presented a fact to someone and the other person go, oh, that must be true, I'm just going to believe it? It doesn't happen, does it? But does that stop us doing that? It doesn't. So that's one of the first things. We have to realize just presenting facts in their raw form does not work. And there's so many studies to prove this. People don't respond that way. What we've got to start doing is start sharing information in the right way that works. The other thing we need to do is clear the communication channel. If we feel lots of negative emotions towards the people we're trying to communicate with, it's not going to work. So we really have to resolve the emotions that we have inside, and we've got plenty of videos to show you how to do that. The other thing we have to do is we have to be very cautious to understand what is the meaning of the thing that we are saying. Okay? So if someone come up to you and called you a sheep, how would you feel? Okay, you wouldn't feel very good at all. So it's very important not to say anything in any way that's going to make the other person defend. Okay? Because you can't trigger the gorilla. Okay? The minute that you've triggered defense in someone, you're not going to have a good conversation. Okay? And then what we have to do is we have to work out where that person is in their understanding of the facts. And that's the thing. We need to also do our research. And it's not to take things firsthand. We really need to understand that the information that we've researched is very solid. Okay? It is very challenging. I interviewed Meryl Nass a few weeks ago, and she said a lot of the science is really, it's funded, and a lot of it, I think there was in the Lancet, was it the Lancet? I think they said up to 50% of it could be fraudulent because there's so much money at stake, and that's very dangerous. But it looks so solid now, so it's really important to be, really assess what it is. And I think you've really got to meet people where they are, yeah? What is it that's important to people? I think most people can look around and see that there's so much corruption in the world. There's so many things where, when we look at what Cheryl Atkinson showed in her book Slanted, which for any journalist is a must-read, she has many, many, many stories of where she wasn't allowed to air it because it would have impacted certain companies' revenue. That really is a problem. I don't think there's many people that would say that they want corruption to be mainstream. But with behavioral science now, it's almost that, companies lie as a matter of just doing business. Yeah, when we look at companies that build in obsolescence to their products, that's lying. They're designing it to break on purpose. So I think what I'm going to do now is just to talk about what does work. Really what does work is really finding a connection to the person you're talking to really listen. You've got to meet them where they are. How do they see the world? Yeah? And if they see the world different from you, there's a good chance that they've just been exposed to different information. They don't have the experiences. Yes, there's a lot of people that don't want to face up to things that are going on. There's a lot of people that want to put their head in the sand. But there's also a lot of people that just haven't been exposed to the information in the right way. Now, in the 70s, there was a very famous psychologist, Jerome Bruner, and he showed that if you were just to tell a raw fact to someone, it actually wouldn't have much effect on changing their mind. But if you put that fact into a story and delivered it, it would actually land 30 times more effective. Yeah, that's 30 times more effective. So really, when we understand how a person thinks, yeah, when we start to understand how we think more, then I think we understand a lot more about this. So let me ask you a question. Do you decide to get angry? Now really think about that. Okay? And then the obvious answer is you don't decide your emotions for the most of the time. They arise naturally. So when you're talking to someone and they get angry, yeah, we have to understand that we've said something that has made them feel threatened, and then they've got angry, okay? They haven't decided to get angry. It's a natural process. Has anyone ever said, next Friday at 4:30, I'm going to fall in love? You don't, yeah? And when you think about the conclusions you come to, the answer's in there, the conclusions that you come to. You don't sit there and decide what you're going to believe. It's a matter of exposing yourself to wide ranges of information, knowing who you can trust, and then you come to a conclusion, okay? And that's a really important point. So if someone has arrived at a conclusion and you're saying, no, that's not true, that's wrong, what do you think is going to happen? Anyone want to guess? They're just going to reject you, okay? Because that is what's known as cognitive dissonance. You are supplying information that's different from what they believe, and it's just going to be rejected. So it's really important, if you can understand this, I'm just going to sort of mime out this little simple model, which is, if this is my consciousness, and this is the conclusions I'm coming to, I come to a conclusion based on all of this information over here. But what you want to understand is that all of that information happens like that in a split second unconsciously, okay? And what many of the corporations know now is that they can affect information that happens here so that they can influence my conclusion, okay? Typical example, if you're in the supermarket and you hear French music playing on the speaker, which most people actually wouldn't consciously hear, that would affect about 3/4 of the people purchasing wine. So if they played French music one day, German the next, the sales of French music shoot up versus the sales of German wine. But all of this, because it's invisible, you can't see it, you're not knowing that it's affected your conclusion. That makes sense? And we talk about this more on some of the videos. But it's really important to understand. You've got to get inputs into someone's mind that are more accurate, and then the conclusion will change. And that really is it. We've got to find a way of finding out, one, what is the truth, two, delivering the truth to people, and then the conclusions will change, okay? Some other little tips would be that if you are smeared as a conspiracy theorist or an anti-vax or any of these terms, whenever you say anything to someone, they are going to ignore everything you say, okay? We've got to just basically ask lots of soft questions, and we've got to have conversations where we can exchange correct facts in a story, via a metaphor, or in a question. Yeah, and that's really the key. And over the last few months, we have interviewed psychologists and scientists, and there's thousands out there. And, you know, when you start to look at this subject and just start to ask some basic questions, I think you're going to get a lot of answers in how to reach people. Okay, so I think that really sums it up for me. It's really, you know, stories are what make the world go round. You know, it was Plato that said those that tell the stories rule society. And of course, the media have a very important role to play. But the question is that, you know, I think we've got to air both sides of the story. And anytime you see censorship, that should always be a very, very big red flag for anyone. And you've only got to look at some of the, you know, countries like China, etc., when, you know, if anyone's shut down for saying anything, you know, we don't want to end up like that. It's very important that we don't. Do I have time to answer any questions? Yeah, so just a couple of the main questions that people would have. So anyone wish to ask a question? Because it's often, I think behavioural science will give you a lot of answers in why people have been responding the way they respond, and also why people think what they think, okay? Because if you think about most of the information that people have in their mind, if that's not true, what conclusions are they going to come to? You're going to come to some very bizarre conclusions, and that's what led Voltaire to say, if you can convince me of absurdities, then I can commit atrocities.
Any questions for David? Melissa?
I think, so the question was, are things changing? I think things are changing. I think that the fact that you have governments using behavioural science on the public with total disregard for the effect. I mean, COVID anxiety syndrome is massive. When people realise they've been lied to, that is massive, because they start to question everything that particular person has told them. I think when you look at, the censorship of anyone that claims to have been injured by the vaccine, to shut them up and say it's not true, how can you say that person is not having that experience? So anytime we're seeing censorship, it's a massive issue, and because so many people that I interviewed a lot of scientists, and they've got so many cases of people that have been injured, that I think people are starting to ask questions. I think that when it affects people, they really do start to listen. So I think what you're looking at now is a lot of things in the world are starting to affect people on a daily level. And until you've been censored, it's not a problem. But when you've been censored, then you start to realize. And there's that Dr. Boz a few weeks ago when she showed a published medical article, which was later retracted for no reason other than it caused a lot of problems. So, come here. So, it's my dog. So I think you are entering a massive window of opportunity, but it's really important that we think about, because one of the mistakes that we all make, that if any one of us, two of us got together now and started talking, we may have a similar view on lots of things, but not on everything. But the problem is that's why these conspiracy theorist labels and anti-vaxxer labels are so damaging, because you throw the baby out with the bathwater. So some of the things that people are coming out with are not true, and we know that. But on a general scale, anyone that's questioning the policies is purely a sensible thing to do. And anyone that says you can't ask a question should make you double down in asking that question. Yeah. So in the answer to that, I think we're entering a massive window of opportunity. But here's the big tip. Know where that person is, and don't, how many years did it take you to know what you know now? Okay, and you think you want to tell someone that in 10 minutes? Okay, it's not going to happen. We've got to slowly, work out each piece.
Another question, Simone?
Yes. Yes. Yes, so what you often have is that when someone wants to push it's like any advertising, you grab someone very famous, you put them next to your product, and then the product gets a lot more recognition. So you had the Stephen Hawking Foundation, which was approached by the vaccine manufacturers, and they got together with some other think tanks, and they put together a PowerPoint presentation, and that PowerPoint presentation went into the schools. It was 40 pages. I got together with a number of other people that were experts in the field, and we'd never seen anything really a disgraceful use of psychological manipulation. They had things where they would use so many scare tactics to get a child to want to take the vaccine and then to go home and tell their parents they wanted to take it. One of the lawyers said that there was a child in one of the London schools where they said to everyone in the school, if you don't want to take the vaccine, put your hand up. The child put their hand up. They then got the child at the front of the school, front of the class, and to explain to all the other people why she didn't want to take it. This kind of manipulation is really dangerous, because when it's in the hands of people that are looking to make profit, that's when we're going to see some really dangerous things happen. So thanks for pointing that out. The video of that is on Rumble, because you can't put it on YouTube because they will just take it down.
Time for one more question for David. Anyone's got one? No? Well, thank you very much, David. Oh,
Thank you.
More? Someone? Oh, yes.
What about the professional bodies, the professional psychological bodies and psychiatric bodies who've been abusing their position?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of them backtracking now, because Gary Sidley, he's a really lovely man. He's a retired psychologist in the NHS, 30 years. He just had a paper published which was pointing out all the, because what they did, they were funded by a couple of scientific organizations. They wanted to know who were the people pushing the advertising during the pandemic. And then they found all the people, and they're starting to expose the names and the reasons why they did what they did. And they've published that paper, which you can certainly get a copy of. And what you're finding a lot of the time now is that a lot of the bodies, the professional bodies, had such pressure to conform that pretty much all of them did conform. And those that spoke out were obviously censored, but I think we're entering a different fray now, that I think a lot of people are becoming aware that things like look 'em in the eyes and these things were really a nasty use of psychological manipulation. And I think there's going to be a massive blowback. I think to manipulate a public and not let them know how they're being manipulated is a very dangerous line to cross. And I think the professional bodies really, the members need to speak up. But it's easy for, I didn't need the income during the pandemic. I lived very, modestly, so I weren't at risk. But if I had a wife and 4 kids and 2 houses and cars to run, and suddenly my job relied on me just towing the party line, whilst I probably wouldn't have done, you can at least try and understand why a lot of people did, especially if they didn't realize just how dangerous that sort of slippery slope is. So I think the bodies really have to be petitioned by a lot of the practitioners in those particular bodies. But it is very important, because there is an illusion of consensus. And that's one of the biggest problems, that people believe this, because they think, oh, well, I had someone go to, well, all the scientists in the world think so, it must be safe. I said, but Pfizer never released the data. How many people have the data? Yeah, so it's that kind of emperor's new clothes, where they're like, everyone's relying on someone else. And what you point out was really important, that most people trust the governing bodies. But the MHRA is 86% funded by the pharmaceutical industry. And as we know, in the financial crash of 2008, what did the financial regulators do? Has anyone watched The Big Short? They basically gave dog shit, like mortgages, AAA rating. And then when they were quizzed why you did that, they said, well, if we don't do it, then the guys down the road will do it. So we don't understand how important funding is. And it's massively important. Everyone will deny that their funding has any influence over their decision, but the data shows different. And I think probably just to finish on that point is that what we think would happen and what actually does happen is not the same thing. And they've done so many studies in every area now that they understand all the different variables that will make you like someone and trust someone more. If I said to you, if someone spills a cup of coffee, would you trust them more? You'd go, no. But you do. Okay, there's all these really weird variables that make a difference, and that's why they're so dangerous, because they're stealth. But I think the question before, there is a big opportunity coming, and I think everyone's going to start asking questions, and that's really the place to start. Great, thank you.
Thank you, David. So I did say we're going to learn something today, and that was a very good presentation by David to get us started. We're going to have a break after the next speaker, right? But I'm sure you're going to have lots to talk about after the next speaker. An illustrious medical dissident. I first met Angus Dalgleish at a EU referendum meeting in Sutton a few years ago, and I remember back then he was asking difficult questions. Angus, like me, writes some very difficult pieces on the Conservative Woman website too, so we share a couple of things in common. Professor of Oncology at St George's Hospital Medical School, and he's been a COVID-19 dissident from the outset. He's strongly critical of the vaccines and has raised alarm over the surge in cancer diagnoses and worsening of existing malignant disease, which seems to be related, at least temporarily, with the vaccine rollout. So I'm sure Angus will be telling us a bit more about that today. He's also got a new book out, which I believe he may have some copies with him today, but certainly be able to buy it on Amazon. It's called The Death of Science. And Angus, I'm sure, like me, as a professional, very dismayed at how easily the health professions largely fell for the COVID narrative. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Angus Dalgleish.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you very much for asking me to talk to you, and I'm very happy to, because I've just been disgusted at what's happened over this COVID pandemic. Right from the very start, I worked with a group in Norway, and we had designed a very effective HIV vaccine which had gone under trials, and I mean, it was the only one that worked, but nobody would take it up. And we were really amazed at this because we'd shown that it worked, it didn't have side effects, and there seems to be a massive silence about it. So that is why, when COVID was sequenced, my colleagues called me up from Germany and they said, we don't like the look of this sequence, that there seems to be some abnormalities in it. So let's have a look at it, and let's have a look how we would design a decent vaccine that would work. And the first thing that I think we should know is that we were alarmed that 80% of the spike protein, which is used by as the major part of the vaccine by Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, etc., 80% of it was homologous, i.e. very similar to human proteins. I mean, it was an incredible amount. And that meant you should not include this in any vaccine. And we made this very clear. The two things that we picked were screaming, was a thing called platelet factor 4, and that this would cause terrible problems with clots and myocarditis and strokes, etc. And the other was myelin. And myelin's been known to be a crossover activity with even flu vaccines because that's associated with Guillain-Barré syndrome and other forms of paralysis. Now, we screamed at this. We managed to get our data through to the Cabinet Office while pointing out, too, that this virus had escaped from the Wuhan lab. There was absolutely no discussion for it because there were 6 inserts which had been put around the receptor binding site, and people say I'm just a clinician, an oncologist, I don't know about these things and I should shut up. Yeah, that's what they told me. But I did the HIV. I was there at the beginning of that, and I got the HIV, and I got the receptor, all the details of the receptor in 6 major papers in Nature, Cell and Science, etc., and massive other papers in Lancet. Remember those journals. Please remember those journals, what I'm going to tell you, because when we actually pointed out that the virus sequence had all these inserts in it, and they had previously published, we'd put some of these inserts in and they make the virus much more infectious to human cells. We thought, well, this is it. It's absolutely clear. It's come from the laboratory. And we sent another paper to the Cabinet Office. They were reviewed by SAGE and all these other people who decided, to our amazement, that it wasn't important and just to shut up and go away. There was no debate. We should have been called in for debate to put the science out there because of the major implications. If they went ahead making a vaccine based on the spike protein, that it would be a disaster. And they did. And we were told to shut up because 150 academics and major pharmaceuticals and minor pharmaceuticals all said this is how to make a vaccine. They all used the spike protein, the whole lot of it, then everything else after that was different. But it's the spike protein that would cause the problem. Now, I was absolutely amazed that they wouldn't take any notice. But here's the next bit. We wrote our paper up, and it was just complete factual. It's just pointing out the facts. It was extremely well referenced, and we sent it to Nature, Science, Virology, Lancet, go on and on. They all rejected it within 5 hours. Normally a scientific paper takes 3 or 4 weeks to consider, and then they might get further referees. They said everyone was an identical letter. It's like they all had the letters ready to go. We've no criticisms of the science, but this observation is not in the public interest. Therefore, we cannot publish it. I mean, it's unbelievable. And these are journals that I'd published all my HIV work in suddenly. So we knew then there was something really, really dreadful going on with this. So anyhow, it came out that they had the vaccine. And I must say, I just told you what I knew, so I was not keen on the idea. But they came out with it with evidence that it had worked and there was no side effects. So even I thought, well, perhaps we were a bit alarmist about this or something. But then now we know that the early trials had terrible side effects and they were all covered up. We know the VARS data, which is the vaccine adverse events set, Pfizer tried to bury for 75 years. It was only an amazing court case in the US that the Supreme Council basically said you have to release that data. When that data was released, it was very clear that the side effect profiles were just totally, utterly unacceptable. If you had a serious adverse action in the trial data, you had the 3% chance of dying from the vaccine. If you caught COVID, you had less than 1% chance. And yet, the authorities, everybody, allowed this to go through. And I just can't believe that they could possibly do this. I mean, they couldn't understand sequences, they couldn't understand all these things. These advisors, experts, they all completely, utterly got it wrong. And I really couldn't believe that the MHRA are very aware of this data and they've allowed it to be approved. But the problem was it was approved everywhere. It's just unbelievable how it was. And what I really wanted to point out about the vaccine and those adverse events is how they were all covered up, that everybody went along with it. Yes, they're okay. They're all minor. They're very rare. They're very, very rare. And it's clear they weren't rare. I mean, I basically started to see, as the vaccine was rolled out, people complaining of all sorts of things, and their doctors, the hospitals, my hospital, all told them it's just a coincidence, it's just anecdotal, nothing to see here. And that is what I think is actually the worst thing. There was no feedback. And just so I look at it and I say, how on earth could they have allowed this dreadful data to be approved? Well, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Moderna, they used a thing of statistics in which it was relative risk. So they used all the data, relative risk, 95%. If you had that virus, if you had the vaccine, that was what it would do. It'd be 95%, magic letter. But relative risk is real. It really is unbelievable syllogism or whatever. Because if you look at the real data, the absolute risk was 0.84. So what does that mean? That means that you had to vaccinate 120 people to prevent one infection. And my God, once you're at that level, it's a complete waste of time. And yet our regulators, the FDA, the whole of Europe, Australia, Canada, they all approved it on that. And I must say that I didn't spot this until one of my collaborators, who's used to looking at all these things, spotted it. And then when we point this out, nothing happens. Nothing happens. So this is where I've been coming from, is that I really believe that the vaccine should never, ever have been approved on the data we know now. And we know that it was sophistry, they lied, they withheld data, they presented false data, and now we know Pfizer have 31 convictions, which include withholding data, presenting false data, bribing clinicians, and bribing regulators. Now, to that, you can add bribing politicians in my book too, because nobody would listen to us. There's a vast body. I'm one of over 100 doctors that have written consistently to Whitty, the NHS, MHRA, Department of Health, pointing out all this and that the vaccine program is a disaster. And we only ever had one reply from the MHRA thanking us for our communication to remind us that it's the best regulatory authority in the world. That was all they said, and that's the only feedback. So this is why I was inclined to say what we are witnessing is the death of science. You're no longer allowed to discourse, look at things, analyse things in debate. It's been decided by the science. We're following the science. There was never any science to follow. It was an absolute disaster. So I'm going to just finish with the bringing you up to date was as soon as they wheeled out the booster, you know, I went ballistic about this because as a long-term vaccine man researching vaccines, there's an old adage, if you require a booster, the vaccine doesn't work. And I think we've just found out that that adage is still very, very true for this. They gave the booster purely based on the fact that when they followed somebody who'd been vaccinated, the antibody levels fell off. Well, that's what happens every time you vaccinate or you get an infection. All the antibodies and things fall off. And besides, the only thing that really controls everything is the T cell in your innate immune system. And what we found was when they did insist on rolling out the booster, which I said was to a virus, by this time, remember, it's over a year later, it was against a virus which had already left the planet by at least a year, 18 months. It had mutated so much, it was a complete waste of time. But my fears were actually even worse than I thought, because the booster suppressed the T-cell system, the very one that's going to protect you. I mean, it was unbelievable. It switches the antibodies from being protective to tolerizing, which is why several papers, and I looked at some of them this morning, have shown that if you have a booster vaccine, you're far more likely to get infected with COVID and other viruses and other things. And that there's now no doubt about that. But my interest was when I started seeing cancer patients relapse after the booster. I'd already told them not to have the booster, but their GPs bullied them into having it because they were at risk. And I went public on that. I was told to shut up. Even my own colleagues told me that I was scaring the patients. I said, my job is not to scare the patients. My job is to practice first do no harm. And if I've seen people being given this and it's causing them harm, it's my duty to stop. I was basically carpeted, as it were, by more than one institution and a Royal College for saying, what now? Everybody knows the truth. Everybody knows the truth, that my observations were completely correct then. It's over a year and a quarter since published them. And I was told it was just anecdotal, but all around the world they've been saying this. And it's very interesting. Last week, a paper was published out of Japan, and it was Japan's Office of National Statistics, which don't hide, meddle, fiddle with what our office, I really cannot trust our Office of National Statistics anymore, but it shows absolutely clearly that the cancer incidence has gone up in Japan just due to the vaccine program. They've correlated it absolutely beautifully. I'm alarmed by it because they've done it on deaths. And as an oncologist, I'm interested in incidence because deaths we're very good at treating now tend to occur a few years down the line. But they've picked it up within 2 years. It's highly significant increase of the cancers. And everybody else is starting to see this now. And we gave really good, hard scientific rationale why this is. And I was just delighted that so many people from around the world, all over the world, have published data showing how The boosters in particular can suppress your immune response and actually drive cancers that you have but didn't know you had, as it were. So I'm just going to shut up now. I just basically wanted to get across that people like me as a clinician and as scientists who were unable to make a difference because nobody would listen to us and we were silenced and bullied. I was told we were not allowed to make any comments about the origin of the virus. It had been a decision made by the universities. Well, the universities, of course, who funds the universities now? The Chinese. So everything is being done by the funders again. So I'm going to leave it there and answer any questions. But I just wanted you to know the truth, that what I've been through the last 4 years. And I didn't even get down to all the data I wrote about lockdown and how mad that was. But this is on the vaccine.
Okay, we've got time for maybe 3 questions.
Thank you for an excellent talk. Can you explain why the spike protein is a problem in the vaccine? Do you mind just going over that again? Why it's such a problem?
Right. It's a problem in the vaccine because first of all, it binds a receptor that we know. And you would say you shouldn't really use the whole thing that would bind a receptor. They're called ACE receptors, and they're all over your heart. And the younger and fitter you are, the more you have. So that explains the myocarditis and the heart attacks and our footballers dropping, etc. The second thing we pointed out was that 80% of it had homologies to human proteins. Therefore, you introduce antibodies that would attack self, autoimmunity basically. And all the side effects that we were seeing after the cardiac problems, they're all recognized autoimmune conditions. So that's why we were saying do not use the whole of that protein. But they wouldn't listen.
Would you advise, I don't know if I can really ask this because it's medical advice in a way, but can you say if you would advise ivermectin for young people in classrooms full of vaccinated people? I'm talking about both the vaccine and shedding.
Mm-hmm. So the question is, would I advise ivermectin?
Disable spike protein, and I'm talking about children and adolescents who may not even have been vaccinated, but who are sitting in a stuffy classroom with 30 vaccinated kids, let's say. So both for vaccinated kids and unvaccinated, because we know that spike shedding is real, I think. I
find it a very difficult direct question to answer, but what I can say is that I was very aware that my attitude at the beginning of this was they should forget the vaccine. They should just have done corrected the vast vitamin D deficiency that is present in it. And I wrote to Whitty on all this, who told me there was no evidence. I submitted 100 references, and he said it wasn't convincing enough. That evidence was absolute. The evidence from Pfizer was absolute concocted. So I looked at all the other things that might be useful, and then there was hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, and it was alarming how Fauci shouted those down. You've hit a very, very raw nerve, because it was very clear that ivermectin and vitamin D would cure even the most dreadful case of COVID, provided it hadn't got to the total inflammatory phase. And Pierre Corey has written a book about this called The War on Ivermectin. I recommend you read it. Fauci denounced it as a horse dewormer when it is used to millions of people in the world. It is one of the most incredible drugs in the world. It saved the eyesight of millions every year because it attacks flukes and things like that. And it clearly is fantastic. There's now published data showing that it was good. So the question is, why did Fauci denounce that? I tell you why. I now know. They denounced it because it would have eliminated COVID and they wouldn't be able to get their vaccine through, because you can't get a vaccine registered if there's an approved treatment. And I'm sorry, but this is where we are. I think Fauci should go to jail for what he did. I really do. And I've known, if I can put it into a personal thing, I have known Tony Fauci from 1984 when I became part of the HIV, Intercept and Gallo and Montagnier and everybody. And I was there in Washington in 1984 after we'd had the virus when he announced he would have an HIV vaccine. His institute would prepare an HIV vaccine and it would be ready in 18 months. Nearly 40 years later, still no HIV vaccine. There's been millions of them, but they don't work. And they've had to stop all the trials because the people who got the vaccine did far worse than those who didn't. But they stopped the trials before they officially had to say that. And that's the type of manipulation Fauci's used to and what he did through this entire pandemic. Ivermectin is a very safe drug given to millions of people around the world. And I'll tell you, I'm so interested in it. My chaps in the lab are researching it as an anti-cancer agent because of the pathway it hits. It should be very good for cancer as well. So in short, I would say ivermectin and vitamin D are one of the things that should be given to people who are spike protein toxic. They may have had very bad COVID, long COVID, or who've been given the vaccine and have some problem. I think it could, I really think one of the main things, if I was Ministry of Health, I basically put at the very, very, very top is detoxify the spike protein program because so many people are suffering from the side effects of that, and that to treat that's far more important. Instead, my GP practice said you can now have your spring booster. I mean, can you believe it?
Time for one more question.
I presume that the booster was just a third version of the same thing that they originally had. But do you think there's any additional danger that they were told they could mix and match the different?
The same as the original vaccines, and is there any danger in them mixing and matching different brands of vaccine?
That is a really, really good question. The first boosters were all to the virus that didn't exist, had left the planet years ago. So when it dawned on them, they said, okay, this is another great ruse. We can make vaccines ad infinitum, and we'll just make the next thing, the Omicron variant, this, that, and the other. But they forgot something that's terribly important about coronaviruses, and I summarised in a big paper in Trends in Immunology, pointing out that nobody had ever got vaccine against a coronavirus because it mutates very fast and it induces a thing called antibody-dependent enhancement. And that is what the boosters are doing. So it doesn't matter which one that you use, they will create antibodies, but they actually end up enhancing the infection with the new virus because it's not strong enough to neutralize it. Do you understand that? And also the immune system, once it's locked onto the first coronavirus, everything it sees is the first coronavirus. So even if you vaccinate against something similar, another variant, it will not see it if it's already seen the first one. It's called immunological priming or antigenic sin, if you like looking these things up, but it's just a fact.
Called Stand Together.